In 1969, a small British engineering firm made a bet that would reshape the entire landscape of Formula One. They didn't have the biggest budget. They didn't have the most powerful engine. What they had was an idea so radical, so counterintuitive, that every other team on the grid thought they were insane. They put wings on a race car. Not decorative wings. Not little aerodynamic flourishes. Real, functional, downforce-generating wings that fundamentally changed what a car could do in a corner. Within 2 years, every single team on the grid had copied them. Within a decade, aerodynamics had become more important than raw horsepower. And the team that started it all? The team that saw the future before anyone else? They went bankrupt. This is the story of how aerodynamics conquered Formula One, destroyed the teams that pioneered it, and created the billion-dollar engineering arms race that defines the sport today. Along the way, we'll see careers ended, regulations rewritten overnight, and a philosophy of speed that turned everything engineers thought they knew completely upside down. This is Motorsport Heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about the invisible forces that make race cars fast. If you're someone who lies awake wondering how a car can generate more downforce than its own weight, or why teams spend hundreds of millions on wind tunnels instead of just building bigger engines, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Alright, let's set the stage. To understand why aerodynamics changed everything, you first have to understand what racing looked like before anyone thought about downforce. In the early days of Formula One, the equation was brutally simple. More power equals more speed. You want to go faster? Build a bigger engine, strap more cylinders together, burn more fuel. The car itself was almost an afterthought. It was just a container for the engine and the driver. Chassis design was rudimentary. Suspension geometry was basic. And aerodynamics, well, nobody really thought about aerodynamics at all. If anything, teams wanted their cars to be as slippery as possible, cutting through the air with minimal resistance. The idea of using the air to push the car down, to actually increase the load on the tires without adding weight, that hadn't occurred to anyone yet. And honestly, why would it? It sounds counterintuitive. You want to go fast, so you add drag. You want to be quick in a straight line, so you bolt on surfaces that resist the airflow? It doesn't make sense until you realize that straight-line speed isn't everything. Here's the thing about racing that most casual fans don't fully appreciate. Races are not won on the straights. They're won in the corners. A car that's 2 miles per hour slower on the straight but can carry 5 miles per hour more through every corner will absolutely demolish the faster car over the course of a lap. The math is merciless. A typical Formula One circuit has maybe 4 or 5 significant straights, but 15 to 20 corners. Every corner is an opportunity to gain or lose time. And the limiting factor in corners isn't engine power. It's grip. Mechanical grip, the grip that comes from the tires and suspension alone, has a hard ceiling. You can only make tires so sticky. You can only tune the suspension so precisely. At some point, the physics of rubber on tarmac simply runs out. The car starts to slide. The driver has to back off. Time is lost. But what if you could push the car harder into the ground? What if you could increase the force pressing those tires into the tarmac without adding a single kilogram of weight? More force on the tires means more friction. More friction means more grip. More grip means higher cornering speeds. And that is exactly what aerodynamic downforce does. The first people to figure this out weren't Formula One engineers. They were actually aircraft designers working in reverse. An airplane wing generates lift by creating a pressure differential, low pressure on top, high pressure on the bottom. The wing rises. Flip that wing upside down and you get the opposite effect. High pressure on top, low pressure on the bottom. The wing pushes down. Downforce. It's so elegantly simple that you have to wonder why it took until the late 1960s for anyone in motorsport to try it. The answer, as far as I can tell, is that racing culture was so obsessed with engine power that nobody was looking at the problem from the right angle. Everyone was trying to solve the speed equation with brute force, when the real solution was finesse. The first serious experiments with wings in Formula One came in 1968. Lotus, under the legendary Colin Chapman, and Ferrari both showed up at the Belgian Grand Prix with crude wing structures mounted high above the cars on spindly stilts. The wings were attached directly to the suspension uprights, bypassing the chassis entirely and pushing force straight onto the wheels. And they worked. They worked spectacularly well. Jim Clark's Lotus was noticeably faster through the corners at Spa. The lap times dropped. Other teams watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. Here's what most people don't realize about those early wings. They were terrifyingly dangerous. The structures were flimsy. The mounting points were inadequate. The forces involved were far greater than anyone had calculated. At the 1969 Spanish Grand Prix, both Lotus cars suffered catastrophic wing failures. Graham Hill's rear wing collapsed at over 150 miles per hour, launching his car into the barriers. Jacques Rinde suffered an almost identical failure. Both drivers survived, but the crashes were violent enough to shake the entire paddock. The governing body reacted swiftly, banning the high-mounted wings immediately. But they didn't ban wings entirely. They couldn't. The genie was out of the bottle. Everyone had seen the lap time advantage. Instead, they mandated that wings had to be mounted directly to the chassis, limited in size, and structurally robust enough to withstand defined load tests. And with those regulations, the aerodynamic arms race officially began. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so they put wings on cars. Big deal. How much difference could it really make? Let me give you some numbers that will genuinely blow your mind. A modern Formula One car weighs approximately 798 kilograms with the driver. At full speed, that same car generates roughly 1,500 kilograms of downforce. Read that again. The car pushes itself into the ground with nearly twice its own weight. At speeds above about 130 miles per hour, a modern Formula One car could theoretically drive upside down on the ceiling of a tunnel. The downforce would be more than sufficient to keep it pressed against the surface above. It would just drive along, upside down, as if gravity had reversed. Nobody has actually tested this, for obvious reasons, but the physics checks out. Every engineer I've spoken to confirms that the numbers work. That is the magnitude of what aerodynamics brought to the sport. It didn't just improve cornering speeds by a few percent. It completely redefined what was physically possible. But the path from those crude 1968 wings to the sophisticated aerodynamic packages of today was anything but smooth. It was a decades-long war between engineers trying to find more downforce and regulators trying to slow them down. And some of the most fascinating chapters of that war involve ideas so creative, so devious, and so brilliantly outside the box that they deserve to be studied not just as engineering achievements, but as works of art. Let's talk about ground effect. Because if the invention of wings was the first revolution, ground effect was the second. And it was even more dramatic. The year was 1977. Colin Chapman, the same genius who had pioneered wings a decade earlier, was at it again. His team, Lotus, had been struggling. The dominant cars of the mid-1970s were the Ferraris and the McLarens, and Chapman needed a breakthrough to get back to the front. He found one. Chapman and his chief aerodynamicist, Peter Wright, had been experimenting with a concept borrowed from, of all things, hovercraft design. They realized that the underside of the car could be shaped to accelerate airflow beneath it, creating a massive area of low pressure under the car. This low pressure would literally suck the car toward the ground, generating enormous downforce without the drag penalty of conventional wings. Here's the analogy I like to use. Think about holding a piece of paper horizontally and blowing across the top of it. The paper rises because the fast-moving air on top creates lower pressure than the still air below. Now imagine the reverse. Fast-moving air underneath, higher pressure above. The paper gets sucked down. That's ground effect in its simplest form. The Lotus 78, introduced in 1977, was the first car to seriously exploit this principle. The sidepods were shaped like inverted airplane wings, carefully sculpted to accelerate airflow underneath. Sliding skirts along the sides of the car sealed the gap between the car's floor and the ground, preventing high-pressure air from leaking in and spoiling the low-pressure zone underneath. The results were staggering. Mario Andretti, driving the Lotus 78, won 4 races that season. The car was visibly faster through corners than anything else on the grid. Other drivers described it as looking like it was on rails, glued to the track in a way that seemed almost supernatural. But the 78 was just the beginning. The following year, Chapman unleashed the Lotus 79, a refined, perfected version of the ground effect concept. And this is where it gets really interesting. The Lotus 79 didn't just have an aerodynamic advantage, it had a transformative advantage. Andretti won 6 races in 1978 and took the World Championship. His teammate, Ronnie Peterson, won 2 more. Lotus won the Constructors' Championship by a mile. The car was so superior that other teams were left scrambling to understand what Chapman had done. The rest of the grid spent the winter of 1978 tearing apart everything they thought they knew about car design and starting from scratch. By 1979, virtually every team had adopted some form of ground effect. The era of the wing car had begun. But ground effect had a dark side. A very dark side. See, here's the problem with generating most of your downforce from under the car. When it works beautifully. The car has enormous grip, and the driver can push to incredible limits. But when it stops working, when the seal between the car and the ground is broken even momentarily, the downforce disappears almost instantly. There's no gradual loss of grip. One moment you have thousands of pounds of downforce. The next moment you have, essentially, 0. This happened when the car hit a bump, or when a skirt got damaged, or when the car went slightly sideways and the underfloor airflow became disrupted. The result was catastrophic. The car would go from being glued to the track to being essentially an uncontrollable projectile in a fraction of a second. The driver had no warning and no chance to react. The accidents were horrific. Cars would launch off the track at enormous speeds with no loss of control apparent beforehand. Drivers who were perfectly composed 1 millisecond were passengers the next. The forces involved were lethal. In 1982, the dangers of ground effect cars reached a crisis point. Gilles Villeneuve was killed at Zolder during qualifying. Riccardo Paletti died at the start of the Canadian Grand Prix. While Villeneuve's accident was caused by a collision rather than a pure ground effect failure, the broader safety concerns around these incredibly fast but dangerously unpredictable cars had reached a breaking point. For 1983, the FIA banned sliding skirts and mandated a flat bottom for the area between the front and rear axles. Just like that, the pure ground effect era was over. The cars lost a massive amount of downforce overnight. Teams had to go back to generating downforce primarily through conventional wings. Lap times slowed. The cars became more predictable, but less exciting. Now, you might think that would have settled things. The regulators stepped in, banned the dangerous technology, and everyone moved on. But that's not how Formula One works. Formula One engineers don't accept limitations. They find loopholes. They reinterpret the rules. They innovate around restrictions with a creativity that borders on pathological. And what happened next is one of the most fascinating decades of technical development in any sport ever. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, teams found increasingly clever ways to generate downforce within the regulations. Diffusers, the upswept sections at the rear underside of the car, became extraordinarily sophisticated. Front wings grew more complex, with multiple elements and end plates designed to direct airflow precisely around the front tires and under the car. Bargeboards, those weird vertical panels between the front wheels and the side pods, became critical tools for managing airflow. Every surface of the car became an aerodynamic device. And the budgets exploded. Building a competitive engine had always been expensive. But the aerodynamic arms race introduced a new dimension of spending that dwarfed anything that had come before. Wind tunnels, which had once been niche facilities used occasionally for validation, became the centerpiece of every top team's operation. Teams began running their wind tunnels 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, testing thousands of configurations, chasing hundredths of a second per lap. By the mid-1990s, the cost of aerodynamic development had become the single largest expense for most Formula One teams. Not engines, not drivers, not travel logistics. Aerodynamics. Teams were spending tens of millions of dollars per year on wind tunnel time, computational fluid dynamics, and the specialized personnel needed to interpret the data. And the gap between the teams that could afford this level of investment and those that couldn't grew wider and wider. This is where the story of aerodynamics intersects with the story of inequality in Formula One. The technical regulations were supposed to create a level playing field. In practice, they created an arms race that favored the richest teams. Ferrari, McLaren, and Williams could afford the most sophisticated wind tunnels and the largest aerodynamic departments. Smaller teams were left trying to compete with a fraction of the resources, and the results were predictable. Here's a statistic that illustrates this perfectly. Between 1984 and 1999, only 5 constructors won the World Championship. 5 in 16 seasons. McLaren, Williams, Benetton, Ferrari, and Brabham, though Brabham's single title in that period arguably belongs to an earlier era. The aerodynamic arms race didn't just change how cars were designed, it changed who could compete. And then came Adrian Newey. Look, you cannot tell the story of aerodynamics in Formula One without talking about Adrian Newey. It's simply not possible. The man is, by any reasonable measure, the most influential racing car designer in the history of the sport. And his career is essentially a masterclass in how aerodynamic thinking evolved from a useful tool to the single most dominant factor in Formula One performance. Newey joined March Engineering in the early 1980s, cutting his teeth in IndyCar design before moving to Formula One. His first truly great F1 car was the Williams FW14B in 1992. And here's the thing about that car. It wasn't just good, it was almost offensively dominant. Nigel Mansell won 9 of the 16 races that season and clinched the championship with 5 rounds still to go. The car had active suspension, traction control, and semi-automatic gearbox technology, but underneath all those electronic aids was an aerodynamic package that was simply in a different league from anything else on the grid. Newey understood something that many of his contemporaries hadn't fully grasped. Aerodynamics isn't just about generating maximum downforce. It's about generating consistent, predictable downforce across a wide range of conditions. A car that produces massive downforce at high speed but becomes unpredictable in slow corners is worse than a car with slightly less peak downforce but better balance throughout the speed range. The driver needs to trust the car. If the aerodynamic characteristics change dramatically depending on speed or steering angle, the driver can never fully commit, and committed drivers are fast drivers. This philosophy guided everything Newey did. His cars were famously drivable. Drivers consistently reported that his designs gave them confidence, that the cars felt planted and responsive, that they could push to the absolute limit without feeling like the car was about to betray them. And that confidence translated directly into lap time. After Williams, Newey moved to McLaren, where he designed the MP413 that carried Mika Hakkinen to the 1998 World Championship. Then he went to Red Bull Racing in 2006, and this is where his legend truly reached its zenith. When Newey arrived at Red Bull, the team was a midfield runner at best. They had resources, thanks to Dietrich Mateschitz' energy drink empire, but they lacked the technical sophistication of the established front-runners. Newey changed that almost single-handedly. The Red Bull RB5 in 2009 was a revelation. The RB6 in 2010 was a championship winner. And the RB7 in 2011? Well, let me tell you about the RB7. Sebastian Vettel won 11 races in 2011. 11 out of 19. He took 15 pole positions. He clinched the championship with 4 races remaining. The RB7 was so aerodynamically superior that on certain circuits, particularly those with lots of high-speed corners, the gap to the next best car was genuinely embarrassing. We're talking about half a second per lap or more on some tracks. In a sport where teams spend hundreds of millions to find a tenth of a second, half a second is an eternity. Now, you might be thinking, sure, Newey is brilliant, but isn't this just about having the biggest budget? And that's a fair question. But here's the counter-argument. McLaren, during the period when Newey was at Red Bull, had a comparable budget. Ferrari's budget was larger. Neither team could match the aerodynamic performance of Newey's designs. Money is necessary, but not sufficient. You need the money, and you need the genius. Red Bull had both. This is where it gets really interesting, because Newey's dominance forced the other teams to rethink their entire approach to aerodynamic development. Ferrari hired hundreds of aerodynamicists. Mercedes invested in a new, state-of-the-art wind tunnel at their Brackley headquarters. McLaren built their own technology center with one of the most advanced wind tunnels in the world. The spending spiral accelerated, driven by the knowledge that aerodynamic performance was the key differentiator. And the FIA watched all of this with growing concern. Because while the technical spectacle was impressive, the competitive implications were problematic. Formula One needs close racing to be entertaining. If one team's aerodynamic superiority allows them to disappear into the distance, the spectacle suffers. Fans tune out. Sponsors lose interest. The sport contracts. So the regulators began a long, ongoing campaign to limit aerodynamic development. They restricted wind tunnel hours. They capped computational fluid dynamics resources. They mandated simpler front wing geometries. They changed the regulations around diffusers and barge boards and floor edges, trying to reduce the downforce levels and, more importantly, reduce the sensitivity of the cars to disturbed air. Because here's the other massive problem that aerodynamics created in Formula One: dirty air. When a car is running in clean, undisturbed air, its aerodynamic package works as designed. The airflow is smooth and predictable. The downforce is strong and consistent. But when a car is following closely behind another car, it's running in that car's wake, in air that has been churned up, made turbulent, robbed of its energy. And turbulent air absolutely destroys aerodynamic performance. A car following another car closely can lose up to 40% of its downforce. 40%. Think about what that means for the driver. They're approaching a corner at a speed that requires full aerodynamic grip. But because they're in dirty air, they don't have that grip. They have to brake earlier, turn in slower, and accelerate later. The gap to the car ahead doesn't close. It actually grows. The very act of getting close to another car makes it harder to overtake. This is the fundamental paradox of modern Formula One aerodynamics. The more downforce you generate, the faster you go. But the more downforce you generate, the more dirty air you create for the car behind you. And the more sensitive your car is to dirty air, the harder it is to race closely. Aerodynamics made the cars faster, but the racing worse. For decades, this was the central tension in Formula One regulation. How do you allow the cars to be fast without destroying the spectacle of close racing? Every set of new regulations attempted to address this balance, and every time, the engineers found ways to claw back the downforce that the regulations had tried to take away. The 2009 regulations reduced downforce significantly. Within 2 seasons, the teams had found it all again. The 2014 regulations changed the power unit formula entirely, but kept similar aerodynamic philosophies, and the same problems persisted. The 2017 regulations actually increased downforce deliberately, making the cars faster, but making the dirty air problem even worse. The racing in 2017 and 2018 was criticized as processional. Fast, yes. Spectacular in terms of pure speed, absolutely. But close racing? Wheel-to-wheel battles? Not so much. And then came 2022, and Formula One attempted its most radical aerodynamic reset in the sport's history. The new regulations, which had been in development for years, fundamentally reimagined how the cars generated downforce. The key innovation was a return to ground effect, the same principle that Colin Chapman had pioneered in 1977 and that had been largely banned in 1983. But this time, the implementation was different. The new cars had carefully shaped underbody tunnels that generated a significant portion of their downforce from the floor rather than from the wings. The theory was elegant. Downforce generated from the floor disturbs the air behind the car much less than downforce generated from wings. Therefore, cars running in ground effect should be able to follow each other more closely without losing as much performance. Did it work? Partially. The 2022 cars could follow more closely than their predecessors. Overtaking increased. The racing was generally closer and more entertaining. But, and this is the crucial but, the engineers immediately began finding ways to add downforce through other means, through wing design, through floor edge details, through vortex generation systems that technically complied with the regulations but undermined the spirit of them. The arms race, in other words, never stopped. It just shifted terrain. So where does this leave us? Where does the story of aerodynamics in Formula One go from here? To answer that, we need to look at some trends that are already reshaping the sport, and some that are just over the horizon. First, let's talk about the budget cap. In 2021, Formula One introduced a cost cap for the first time in its history. Teams were limited to spending $145 million per season on performance-related activities, a figure that has been adjusted slightly since then. Now, this number might sound like a lot, and it is by any normal standard. But for top teams that had been spending upwards of $400 million per year, it represented a dramatic reduction. Here's what most people don't realize about the budget cap's relationship to aerodynamics. The cap didn't just limit how much teams could spend overall, it forced them to make choices about where to spend. And those choices revealed something fascinating about the sport's priorities. When teams had unlimited budgets, they could invest heavily in every area simultaneously. Engine development, chassis design, aerodynamics, personnel, facilities, everything got funded generously. But under a cap, every dollar spent on aerodynamics is a dollar not spent somewhere else. And guess what most teams chose to prioritize? Aerodynamics. Even under financial constraints, even when forced to make painful trade-offs, the top teams continued to pour the maximum possible resources into aerodynamic development. Because the fundamental truth hasn't changed. Aerodynamics is still the biggest performance differentiator in Formula One. A better engine might give you 0.2 per lap. Better aerodynamics can give you a full second. Red Bull's RB19, the car that carried Max Verstappen to his third consecutive world championship in 2023, was widely regarded as the most aerodynamically sophisticated Formula One car ever built. It won 21 out of 22 races. 21 out of 22. The dominance was so complete that it actually became a problem for the sport's entertainment value. And the foundation of that dominance was, once again, Adrian Newey's aerodynamic vision. But Newey announced his departure from Red Bull in 2024, moving to Aston Martin. And his departure raises a question that gets to the heart of how aerodynamics has shaped Formula One. Can one person's genius really make that much difference in a sport that employs thousands of engineers and spends billions of dollars? The evidence suggests yes, it can. Not because Newey personally designs every surface of the car, he doesn't, but because his conceptual vision guides the overall aerodynamic philosophy. He sees the big picture in a way that allows him to make fundamental decisions early in the design process that pay dividends throughout development. His teams consistently find aerodynamic solutions that other teams miss, not because they have better tools, but because they have better thinking. And this brings us to perhaps the most interesting development in modern Formula One aerodynamics: the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the design process. Traditional aerodynamic development follows a familiar pattern. Engineers design a component, test it in the wind tunnel or through CFD simulation, analyze the results, modify the design, and test again. It's iterative, methodical, and slow. A single aerodynamic update might go through hundreds of iterations before it reaches the car, and even then, there's no guarantee that the final design is optimal. It might be the best of the options tested, but there could be unconventional solutions that nobody thought to try. AI changes this equation fundamentally. Machine learning algorithms can explore the design space in ways that human engineers simply cannot. They can evaluate millions of potential configurations, identify non-obvious patterns, and suggest solutions that no human would intuitively consider. The shapes that AI generates often look strange, organic, almost biological. They don't conform to the aesthetic sensibilities that human designers have developed over decades. But they work. Several teams are already integrating AI into their aerodynamic development pipelines. The specifics are closely guarded secrets, but the general direction is clear. Over the next decade, AI will become an increasingly important tool in the aerodynamic arms race. And this raises a philosophical question. If the car's aerodynamics are designed primarily by artificial intelligence, does it still count as a human achievement? Is the sport still about the ingenuity of engineers, or has it become about the quality of algorithms? I don't think there's a simple answer to that question, but I do think it's worth considering as the sport evolves. Now, let me bring this back to the bigger picture, because the story of aerodynamics in Formula One isn't just a story about technology. It's a story about how innovation creates unexpected consequences. Every major aerodynamic breakthrough in F1 history followed the same pattern. Someone discovers a new way to generate downforce. The cars get faster. Other teams copy the innovation. The regulators step in to limit it. The engineers find workarounds. The cycle repeats. This cycle has produced some of the most extraordinary machines ever built. It has pushed the boundaries of physics and engineering in ways that have benefited not just motorsport, but automotive and aerospace industries worldwide. The aerodynamic research conducted by Formula One teams has applications in everything from road car design to wind energy to high-speed rail. But it has also created a sport that is, in many ways, a victim of its own success. The cars are so fast, so aerodynamically sophisticated, that they can barely race each other. The dirty air problem, despite decades of regulatory effort, has never been fully solved. The cost of competitive aerodynamic development remains the biggest barrier to entry for new teams, and the performance gaps created by aerodynamic advantages have made truly close championship fights the exception rather than the rule. Formula One is grappling with this tension right now. The 2026 regulations, which will coincide with new power unit rules, represent yet another attempt to reset the aerodynamic playing field. The regulations will introduce active aerodynamics for the first time, with movable front and rear wing elements that adjust based on speed and driving conditions. The goal is to reduce drag on straights while maintaining downforce in corners, allowing cars to follow more closely and race more aggressively. Will it work? History suggests that the engineers will find ways to exploit the new rules in ways the regulators didn't anticipate. They always do. The arms race will continue, just in a different form. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the arms race is the point. Maybe the relentless pursuit of aerodynamic performance is what makes Formula One the most technologically advanced sport on the planet. Maybe the tension between speed and spectacle is what keeps the sport fascinating. Think about it this way. If the cars were all identical, if there were no aerodynamic development, if every team ran the same car with the same wings and the same floor, the racing would certainly be closer. But would it be Formula One? Would it have the same magic? I'd argue no. The genius of Formula One has always been that it's a constructors' championship as much as a drivers' championship. The engineers are athletes too, competing with slide rules and wind tunnels instead of steering wheels and brake pedals. Aerodynamics is the arena where that engineering competition is most fiercely fought. From those crude wings bolted to the suspension of a 1968 Lotus to the AI-optimized, ground-effect machines of 2024, the evolution of aerodynamics in Formula One is one of the great technological stories of the modern era. It's a story of vision and hubris, of breakthrough and tragedy, of regulations written and rewritten and circumvented and rewritten again. It's a story that isn't over, that probably will never be over, as long as there are engineers who look at a race car and think, what if I shape this surface just a little differently? And that, I think, is what makes this sport endlessly compelling. The physics doesn't care about regulations. The air flows the way the air flows. The only question is who's clever enough to make it work for them. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about this stuff as much as I do. Drop a comment and tell me, what's the most impressive aerodynamic innovation in F1 history? The original wings? Ground effect? The Braun diffuser? Newey's blown diffuser? I'd love to hear what you think. Subscribe if you haven't already. We go deep on motorsport history every single week, and I promise you the next one is going to be just as good. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.